I drove past my father-in-law's place and saw my daughter's school bag on the porch. She should have been at school. I slammed the brakes and felt the sort of panic that makes a man rethink everything he knows about trust. It was a bright, obnoxious Tuesday morning, the kind where the sun glares off the windshields of expensive SUVs like a physical insult. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My daughter Juniper was supposed to be in third period math, probably doodling in the margins of her notebook. Instead, her purple backpack, the one with the frayed straps and the glittery keychain I'd helped her pick out, was sitting like a discarded witness on Sullivan Vance's pristine wraparound porch. Sullivan Vance, the Honorable Judge Vance, as he liked to remind everyone even though he'd been retired for 5 years, he lived in a house that looked like it belonged on a postcard for people with too much money and too little personality. It was a white-pillared monstrosity in the hills, surrounded by manicured lawns that were greener than they had any right to be. Seeing that bag, there was like seeing a flare in the night. It meant Harlow was up to her old tricks, and Sullivan was providing the stage. I sat in my car for a heartbeat, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic thrum that matched the pounding in my temples. My mind immediately went to the legal documents sitting on my kitchen counter back home. The mediation papers, the custody schedules, the carefully negotiated boundaries that Harlow treated like suggestions rather than mandates. She was trying to cheat the system again. She was likely inside, coaching our 8-year-old on what to say to the court-appointed evaluator, turning my daughter into a pawn in a game designed to erase me from the picture. I shifted the car into gear, but my eyes caught a flash of movement in the rearview mirror. A black sedan was idling at the corner, 2 houses down. I recognized the silhouette in the driver's seat. Marcus. My former partner, a man I'd shared 1,000 shifts with, now reduced to a glorified errand boy for my soon-to-be ex-wife. He was watching me. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight in my chest, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so thorough. Marcus knew the law as well as I did, and here he was, helping Sullivan and Harlow bypass it. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a wave. I pulled away from the curb, but I didn't drive toward the house yet. If I charged in now, Sullivan would have me arrested for trespassing before I could even say hello. He was a master of the legal leverage, a man who knew exactly how to make a victim look like an aggressor. I needed to be smarter. I needed to be the detective I was trained to be, not the frustrated father I felt like. I circled the block, my inner commentary providing a sarcastic play-by-play of the disaster. Great job, Beckett. You've got the judge, the ex-wife, and the former best friend all lined up against you. All you need now is a marching band and a giant sign that says Easy Target. I checked my watch. 10:15 a.m. The evaluator was scheduled to meet Juniper at school at noon. If Harlow had pulled her out of class, she was likely planning to keep her hidden until the appointment was over, claiming Juniper was too ill to attend, or worse, using the time to brainwash her into saying she was afraid of me. As I rounded the corner back toward the Vance estate, I saw Harlow's silver European sedan backing out of the long, winding driveway. She was moving fast, too fast. Through the tinted glass, I saw the small, pale face of my daughter in the back seat. Juniper looked small. She looked scared. I felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of my frustration. I didn't hesitate. I swung my car across the narrow residential street, tires screeching against the asphalt in a way that would surely upset the neighbor's delicate sensibilities. I blocked the exit to the driveway just as Harlow reached the gate. She slammed on her brakes, the nose of her car dipping sharply. I stepped out of my car, my movements deliberate and calm. I wasn't the angry ex-husband. I was a man who had seen enough crime scenes to know when a narrative was being manufactured. I walked toward her driver's side window, my boots crunching on the gravel. Harlow lowered the window just an inch, her eyes narrowed, her face a mask of practiced indignation. "Beckett, you're blocking the road," she said, her voice cool and sharp. "I'm taking Juniper to an emergency dental appointment. Get out of the way or I'll call the police." "The police?" I leaned down, resting my hands on the doorframe. I gave her a thin, joyless smile. "That's a great idea, Harlow. Let's call them. We can talk about why Juniper isn't in school, why you didn't notify me of this emergency, and why Sullivan's car is currently blocking the back exit of the property. I'm sure my colleagues would love to hear all about custodial interference on a Tuesday morning." I looked past her to the back seat. "Hey, Junie, how's the tooth?" Juniper didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, clutching a stuffed rabbit like it was a life preserver. She wasn't in pain. She was in a trance of confusion. "She's fine, Beckett. Move the car," Harlow hissed. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a level that usually made suspects start sweating. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to put that car in park. You're going to let me talk to my daughter. and then we're all going to have a very long, very documented conversation about where she's supposed to be right now. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sullivan stepping out onto the porch. He looked every bit the retired power player in his silk robe and leather slippers, holding a phone to his ear. He was likely already on the line with the precinct commander, spinning a tale about a disgruntled detective harassing his family. The man was a shark in a tailored suit, even when he was off duty. I felt the familiar prickle of surveillance. Marcus's sedan had moved up. He was sitting at the edge of the property now, his camera probably out, recording my every move. They were trying to provoke me. They wanted a scene. They wanted me to yell, to lean into the car, to give them the evidence they needed to show I was unstable. I took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of the morning air. I knew how this worked. Sullivan thought he could use his influence to bury me under a mountain of legal technicalities. Harlow thought she could use my daughter as a weapon to punish me for leaving, and Marcus was just a reminder that loyalty was a luxury I couldn't afford. "I'm not moving, Harlow," I said, loud enough for Sullivan to hear from the porch. "In fact, I think I'll just sit right here and wait for the officers to arrive. I've already called it in. I told them there was a suspicious vehicle in the area and a potential domestic disturbance involving a minor. It's all on the record now." It was a lie, but a calculated one. I hadn't called anyone yet, but I knew Sullivan couldn't risk the optics of a squad car showing up at his gates while he was trying to maintain his reputation. The smirk on his face flickered for a fraction of a second. He knew I was playing his game, and he didn't like that I knew the rules. Harlow gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just show up and ruin everything." "I'm not ruining anything," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm just making sure the truth doesn't get lost in the shuffle. So you want to play the victim? Fine. But don't use my daughter to do it." I looked back at the house. Sullivan was watching me like a scientist watching a specimen under a microscope. He thought he had the upper hand because he had the money and the connections. He thought my sarcasm was a sign of weakness, a defense mechanism for a man who had lost his way. He didn't realize that my observations weren't just cynical asides. They were data points. Every sneer, every hidden glance, every coordinated move between them was being filed away in my head. I had spent my career catching people who thought they were smarter than the law. Sullivan Vance was just another target, even if he used to sit on the bench. He had spent his life in a courtroom where he was the king, but out here on the street, in the harsh light of a Tuesday morning, he was just a man trying to hide a secret. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound from inside the house. A cry. Not a scream, but a sharp, panicked sob that didn't sound like it came from the car. I looked at Juniper. She was still in the back seat, but her head was turned toward the house. "What was that?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. Harlow looked panicked. She tried to roll the window up, but I kept my hand on the glass. "Nothing," she snapped. "Move your car, Beckett. Now." I didn't move. The sound came again, a high-pitched, desperate wail that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. It wasn't Juniper. It was coming from the house, and it sounded like it was coming from someone who didn't want to be found. I looked at Sullivan. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking back at his own front door, his face suddenly pale, his phone forgotten in his hand. The professional mask had slipped, and for the first time in my life, I saw the Honorable Judge Vance look genuinely afraid. I realized then that this wasn't just about a custody hearing. There was something else happening in that house, something that Harlow and Sullivan were desperate to keep hidden. My daughter's school bag on the porch wasn't just a sign of a missed class. It was the tip of an iceberg that was about to rip through the hull of their perfect lives. "Stay in the car, Junie," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned and started walking toward the house, ignoring Harlow's screams and the sound of Marcus's car door opening behind me. The revenge I had planned was going to have to wait. There was a secret behind that mahogany door, and I was going to be the one to drag it into the light. The sound from the house wasn't a ghost, though Sullivan Vance looked like he'd seen one. It was a rhythmic, desperate sort of wail, the kind of noise a person makes when they have run out of words and only have oxygen and panic left. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for the inevitable legal threats that I knew were already forming in Sullivan's throat. I charged up the porch steps, my boots echoing like hammer strikes on the expensive wood. "Beckett, get back here!" Harlow screamed from the driveway, her voice cracking with a desperation that only fueled my momentum. I ignored her. I ignored Marcus, who I could see in the periphery of my vision, finally stepping out of his sedan with a look of professional hesitation. He was a follower, always had been, and without a clear directive from Sullivan, he was just a spectator to his own betrayal. I reached the front door and gripped the handle. Locked. Of course it was. Sullivan Vance didn't leave his fortress vulnerable to the truth. I turned to see Sullivan standing near the porch railing, his knuckles white as he gripped his smartphone. Hayes, if you cross that threshold, I will have your badge before the sun sets. You are trespassing on private property. This is a violation of every restraining order I can manufacture by lunch. Then start typing, Sullivan, I snapped, my adrenaline humming, because I hear a child in distress, and as an officer of the peace, I have probable cause to ensure the safety of whoever is behind this door. I didn't give him time to argue. I stepped back, centered my weight, and drove the heel of my boot into the area just beside the lock. The frame groaned, quality craftsmanship, no doubt, but it wasn't designed to withstand a man who had spent a decade kicking in doors for a living. On the second strike, the wood splintered with a satisfying crack, and the door swung inward, hitting the interior wall with a heavy thud. The hallway was cool, smelling of expensive beeswax and old money. I moved fast, my eyes scanning the rooms. The crying had stopped the moment the door broke, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. I passed the formal dining room and the library, my mind mapping the layout of the house. I knew where the coaching happened. Sullivan had a sunroom in the back, a place where he liked to sit and play God over his family's affairs. I burst into the sunroom and stopped. The scene was more pathetic than I had imagined. My daughter, Juniper, wasn't the only one being manipulated. In the center of the room, sitting on a high-back chair that made her look even smaller, was a young girl I recognized from Juniper's school, a girl named Sophie. She was holding a stack of flashcards, her eyes red and puffy, her face a mask of exhaustion. Scattered around her were Sullivan's legal tablets, several recording devices, and a script. Sullivan hadn't just been coaching Juniper, he was running her rehearsals. He was using other children to refine the lies he wanted my daughter to tell the court evaluator. It was a factory of fabricated trauma, a workshop where reality was being dismantled and reassembled to suit a custody narrative. Daddy? I spun around. Juniper had followed me in, having slipped away from Harlow in the chaos. She stood in the doorway, her eyes darting from me to the girl in the chair and then to the script on the floor. The look on her face wasn't just fear, it was a dawning, terrible realization. She saw the strings. She saw how the puppet show worked. Junie, stay back, I said, my voice softening just enough to keep her grounded. I walked over to the table and picked up the tablet. It was active. I scrolled through the recent files. Video after video of Sophie and others being prompted to describe scary behavior, to use specific words like unpredictable and aggressive when referring to me. It was a masterclass in psychological grooming. You're a real piece of work, Sullivan, I said, not looking up as the man himself entered the room, his face a shade of purple that matched the bruises on his reputation. Harlow was right behind him, her hands trembling. You have no right to look at those, Sullivan hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Those are privileged notes. Work product. You've just committed a dozen felonies, Hayes. Work product? I held the tablet up, my thumb hovering over the delete button, though I had no intention of pressing it. I wanted him to feel the precarity of his position. This is evidence of witness tampering and custodial interference. You're using a minor to rehearse a fraudulent testimony. I don't think the ethics committee is going to see this as privileged. I turned to Sophie. Honey, you can go. Your mom is going to pick you up in a minute. I'm going to make sure of it. The girl didn't wait. She scrambled out of the chair and bolted past Harlow, disappearing toward the front door. Beckett, stop this, Harlow pleaded, her voice shifting from anger to a manipulative tremor. We were just making sure the kids were prepared. It's a high-stress situation. Sullivan was helping. Helping? I laughed, a sharp, cynical sound that cut through her act. He was building a cage, Harlow, and he was using our daughter as the lock. I looked at Juniper. She was standing very still, her eyes fixed on the script I was holding. She walked forward and picked up one of the discarded flashcards. She read it aloud, her voice small but clear. My dad makes me feel unsafe when he raises his voice. I never said that, Grandpa. Sullivan didn't blink. You would have, Juniper, for your own good. We're trying to protect you from a life of instability. The arrogance of the man was breathtaking. He actually believed his own narrative. He thought his influence gave him the right to rewrite a child's heart. She's coming with me, I said, grabbing Juniper's hand. You don't have a court order for today, Sullivan countered, stepping into my path. He was trying to regain his stature, puffing out his chest as if his silk robe were a suit of armor. Today is Harlow's day. If you take her, it's kidnapping. Call it what you want, I said, stepping into his personal space. I was taller than him, younger, and fueled by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. But if you try to stop me, I'm going to start broadcasting these videos to every news outlet and judicial review board in the state. I might lose my badge, Sullivan, but you'll lose your legacy. You'll be remembered as the judge who lost his mind and started kidnapping neighborhood kids for mock trials." I saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing the cost. He looked at the tablet in my hand, then at the shattered front door, then at Marcus, who was standing in the hallway looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. Sullivan Vance was a man who lived by the ledger, and the math wasn't working in his favor. He stepped aside. "This isn't over," he whispered as I passed him. "You've just signed the end of your career." My career was already at risk the moment I married into this family, I shot back, not slowing down. I led Juniper out of the house, my hand firm on her shoulder. Harlow was crying now, a loud, performative sob designed to make the neighbors think she was the victim, but I didn't care. I walked past Marcus, who wouldn't meet my eye. I reached my car, opened the door for Juniper, and made sure she was buckled in. I didn't drive away immediately. I turned back to the house. Sullivan was standing in the doorway, the light from the sunroom silhouetting his frame. He looked like a king whose castle was beginning to crumble. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my police radio, clicking it on. "Dispatch, this is Hayes," I said, my voice loud enough for the porch to hear. "I'm at the Vance residence. I need a transport for a minor and a secondary unit to document evidence of custodial interference and witness tampering. I have digital evidence and multiple witnesses on site." I saw Sullivan's hand grip the doorframe. He hadn't expected me to actually call it in while I was still standing on his property. He thought I'd run and hide, try to use the evidence as leverage in a private deal, but he forgot one thing. I was a detective. I didn't make deals with people who tried to steal my daughter's voice. "I'm also requesting a welfare check on a minor who just left the premises," I continued, giving Sophie's description. "The scene is currently unsecured. One of our own, Officer Marcus Thorne, is on scene. He can provide the initial statement." Marcus looked like he'd been struck by lightning. By naming him, I'd forced his hand. He either had to lie for Sullivan on a recorded dispatch line or tell the truth and save himself. It was a beautiful, chaotic dilemma. I clicked the radio off and looked at Juniper. She was watching me through the window, her face unreadable. I knew I hadn't won the war yet. Sullivan would have his lawyers on the phone within minutes. Harlow would rewrite the events of the morning to make me look like a madman who broke down a door and snatched a child. The legal battle ahead would be a mountain of fire. But as I pulled away from the curb, I saw Sullivan's face one last time. He wasn't smirking anymore. He was staring at the tablet I had left on the hood of my car, a decoy I'd swapped for my own phone, which had been recording the entire confrontation from my pocket. The real evidence was with me. The drive back to my apartment was silent. Juniper didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. There would be time for that later. For now, I just needed to get her somewhere safe, somewhere away from the polished, poisonous atmosphere of the Vance estate. As I pulled into my driveway, I checked the rearview mirror. No one was following us. Not yet. But I knew the escalation was coming. Sullivan wouldn't take this lying down. He would reach out to every contact he had. He would try to crush me professionally, financially, and socially. I walked Juniper inside, making sure the locks were secure. I sat her down at the kitchen table with a glass of juice. Then I went to the window and looked out at the street. The quiet of the suburbs felt like a lie. Beneath the surface of these neat lawns and painted fences, people were tearing each other apart. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You think you've won? Look at your bank account, detective." I felt a cold prickle of anticipation. I logged into my banking app. Balance, $0. Sullivan had already moved. He hadn't just gone after my badge, he'd gone after my survival. He'd used his connections at the regional bank to freeze my assets, likely under some manufactured claim of identity theft or legal lien. I leaned against the counter, a dry, sarcastic laugh escaping my lips. "Well, Sullivan," I whispered to the empty room, "if you wanted to turn this into a fight for survival, you've succeeded. But you forgot one thing about underdogs. We have nothing left to lose, and that makes us very, very creative." I looked at the clock. It was almost noon. The evaluator would be at the school soon. I needed a plan, a way to move through the city without money, and a way to neutralize Marcus before he could provide Sullivan with a way out. The revenge was no longer just about the custody hearing. It was about dismantling the machinery that allowed people like Sullivan Vance to believe they were untouchable. I picked up my keys and looked at my daughter. "Stay with your Aunt Tina," I told her, calling my ally as I headed for the door. "I have some errands to run." The game had truly begun. The 0 on my banking app screen was a round, hollow eye staring back at me, mocking my lack of foresight. Sullivan had moved faster than a man of his age should be able to move, slicing through my financial lifelines with the surgical precision of a high court injunction. I sat in my car outside Tina's apartment, the engine humming a low, steady vibration that felt like the only stable thing left in my world. I had dropped Juniper off with Tina 10 minutes ago. Tina was a forensics specialist who had seen enough of the department's underbelly to know that when I showed up at her door with a confused child and a shattered look, questions were a secondary priority to safety. I tapped my fingers against the steering wheel, my mind a frantic chessboard. No money meant no gas, no leverage, and no way to pay the people who usually helped me navigate the gray areas of the city. I was an underdog in a suit that was starting to wrinkle, and the city skyline looked like a row of jagged teeth waiting to chew me up. Bravo, Sullivan, I thought, my inner commentary dripping with the kind of irony that usually preceded a total meltdown. You managed to turn a detective into a pauper in less time than it takes to order a sandwich. I hope you're enjoying the view from your ivory tower. I knew I couldn't stay stationary. Marcus was out there, likely coordinating with Harlow to track my movements. My phone was a tracking beacon, my car was registered and easily spotted, and my face was on every precinct wall in the district. I needed to disappear, but first I needed to strike back in a way that didn't require a bank account. I needed information, and I needed to mess with Sullivan's sense of security. I drove toward the downtown district, keeping my speed exactly at the limit. I parked 3 blocks away from the courthouse in a metered spot I couldn't afford. If they towed me, it would just be one more thing on the tab Sullivan was eventually going to pay. I walked toward the records office, keeping my hat low and my eyes moving. I wasn't looking for custody files anymore. I was looking for the property records of Sullivan's latest investment. I knew from the office gossip months ago that he had been pouring money into a commercial development in the industrial district, a series of warehouses he was converting into high-end, artistic lofts. It was his legacy project, the thing he intended to live off of once his pension and influence finally dried up. Inside the records office, the air was stale and smelled of toner and bureaucracy. I spotted a clerk I'd helped out on a hit-and-run case a year back. She didn't ask why a detective was looking for private property liens on a Tuesday morning. She just handed over the files. What I found was better than a confession. Sullivan hadn't just invested. He had leveraged his primary residence to fund a project that was currently tied up in environmental violations. He was overextended. The frozen bank account wasn't just a move against me. It was a projection of his own fragility. I left the office with a spring in my step that felt dangerous. I had found the crack in the armor. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a familiar black sedan idling near the intersection. Marcus. He was persistent. I'd give him that. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He wanted me to know I was being watched. He wanted me to feel the walls closing in. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a glance. I got into my car and headed toward the industrial district, the part of the city where the streetlights were usually broken and the only thing moving after dark was the wind. My plan was simple: sabotage and surveillance. If I couldn't touch Sullivan's money, I would touch his pride. I pulled up to the construction site of his loft project. It was a massive brick structure, half shrouded in scaffolding. I knew Sullivan's schedule. He visited this site every afternoon at 2 o'clock to harass the contractors. It was his daily ritual of dominance. I slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence, my movements fluid and practiced. I wasn't here to destroy anything permanently. I was here to create a delay. I found the main electrical box for the site's temporary power. With a pair of heavy-duty pliers I kept in my trunk, I didn't cut the wires. That would be too easy to fix. Instead, I rearranged the circuit breakers and jammed the mechanism with a handful of industrial adhesive. It would take a specialized technician hours to figure out why the power kept tripping, and in the world of commercial construction, hours were worth thousands of dollars. As I was finishing, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I ducked behind a stack of lumber. Sullivan's silver sedan pulled in, but he wasn't alone. Harlow was in the passenger seat, her face tight with agitation. They got out of the car, and I could hear their voices carrying across the hollow space of the warehouse. "He's going to find a way, Sullivan," Harlow was saying, her voice thin and sharp. "You saw him. He's not going to just let us take her." "He has nothing," Sullivan replied, his voice booming with a false confidence that made my skin crawl. "He has no money, no support, and by the end of the week, he'll have no job. Let him play his little games. The evaluator will see a man who has lost his mind and his means. We are providing a stable, wealthy environment. That is all the law cares about." I watched them from the shadows, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, cold focus. They were discussing my life as if it were a ledger to be balanced. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, setting it to record. I caught Sullivan gesturing toward the building, boasting about how the delays were handled and how the environmental inspectors were in his pocket. It wasn't a confession of a major crime, but it was enough to ruin the reputation of a man who prided himself on being the moral compass of the community. Suddenly, a third figure appeared from around the corner of the building. Marcus. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as he approached Sullivan. "He's here," Marcus said, his voice low. "I tracked his car to the perimeter. He's somewhere on the site." Sullivan's face transformed. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a twitchy, predatory alertness. "Find him, Marcus. I don't care what you have to do. Just get him off my property. If he so much as breathes on this project, I want him in zip ties." I didn't wait to be found. I moved through the skeletal interior of the warehouse, using the shadows and the echoes to mask my footsteps. I knew this building better than they did. I'd studied the blueprints in the records office only an hour ago. I led Marcus on a silent chase through the maze of support beams and hanging plastic sheets. I could hear him behind me, his breathing heavy, his boots heavy on the concrete. "Come on, Marcus," I thought, leading him toward the back exit. "You used to be the best tracker in the unit. Now you're just a dog chasing a scent you don't even like." I doubled back through a service corridor and slipped out the side door, leaving Marcus to wander the dark interior of the half-finished basement. By the time he realized I was gone, I was already back at Sullivan's car. I didn't smash the windows, I didn't key the paint. Instead, I used a small valve tool to let the air out of all 4 tires. It was a silent, frustrating inconvenience that would keep them trapped at the site for the next hour. Plenty of time for me to make my next move. I got back to my car just as the first raindrops started to smear the windshield. The city was turning gray and blurred, a perfect backdrop for the second phase of my plan. I drove to a local cafe with free Wi-Fi, using the last of my phone's battery to upload the recording of Sullivan to a secure cloud server. I also sent a copy to Tina with a simple instruction. "Keep this safe. If I don't check in by 6, send it to the local news." My inner commentary was starting to sound like a survival manual. Step 1. Neutralize the pursuer. Step 2. Sabotage the ego. Step 3. Prepare for the fallout. I felt a strange sense of peace. When you have a bank account with a zero balance and a department that wants your head on a platter, you stop worrying about the small things. You stop worrying about the rules. I looked at the reflection of my face in the darkened screen of my phone. I looked tired. I looked like a man who had been pushed to the edge of a cliff, but I also looked like a man who was ready to jump, knowing exactly where the safety net was hidden. I knew Harlow would be the next to break. She was the weak link in Sullivan's chain. She wanted the money and the status, but she didn't have Sullivan's stomach for a long-term siege. If I could make her feel the weight of the consequences, she would turn. She always did. I checked my watch. 3:45 p.m. The school day was over, and the evaluator would be filing their preliminary report by morning. I needed to get to the evaluator's office, but I knew Marcus would be watching the building. I needed a distraction. I reached into my glove box and pulled out a small, handheld police scanner I hadn't used in years. I tuned it to the local frequency and listened to the chatter. There was a minor traffic accident 3 blocks away from the evaluator's office. It was the perfect cover. I drove toward the scene, the rain now a steady downpour. I saw the flashing lights of the patrol cars and the crowd of onlookers. I parked my car in the middle of the chaos, blending in with the other vehicles. I stepped out, turning my collar up against the cold. I saw Marcus's sedan a block away, parked near the evaluator's entrance. He was looking for me, but he was looking for a man in a car, not a man walking through a crowd of rain-soaked pedestrians. I slipped past him, my heart skipping a beat as his eyes swept over the sidewalk. He didn't see me. I reached the office door and stepped inside, the warmth of the lobby hitting me like a physical wave. I wasn't here to steal anything. I was here to leave something. I walked to the reception desk and handed the clerk a small, sealed envelope. "For Dr. Eris," I said, using the name of the evaluator. "It's the supplemental evidence for the Hayes case. It's very important." Inside the envelope wasn't the recording. Not yet. It was a copy of the property records and the environmental violations I'd found earlier. It was a map of Sullivan's desperation. It showed that the stable environment he was promising was built on a foundation of debt and legal trouble. As I walked back out into the rain, I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone was dying, but one last message flickered across the screen. "Harlow just called. She's panicking. Sullivan is furious about the car. You're winning, Beckett. But be careful. Marcus isn't just watching anymore. He's calling for backup." I ducked into an alleyway as a second black sedan turned the corner. Sullivan wasn't just using Marcus. He was hiring outside help. The stakes had just gone up, and the city was suddenly feeling very small. The rain turned the industrial district into a world of shimmering charcoal and iron. I stood in the throat of an alleyway, watching the second black sedan cruise past the mouth of the street like a shark patrolling a reef. Sullivan wasn't just leaning on old favors anymore. He was spending money he didn't have to hire private muscle. It was a sign of a man whose composure was fraying at the edges. My inner commentary, usually a sharp-tongued critic, was now a focused tactician. He's playing his high-value cards early, Beckett. That means he's scared. A man who isn't scared doesn't hire a second set of shadows just because his tires went flat. I needed to neutralize Marcus. He was the bridge between Sullivan's legal influence and the physical reality of the street. If I could separate him from the payroll, or at least make him a liability, the rest of Sullivan's plan would start to wobble. I checked my surroundings. The industrial district was a grid of crumbling brick and corrugated metal, a place designed for transit and storage, not for hiding. I moved deeper into the shadows, my wet coat heavy against my shoulders, my mind cataloging the geography of the next hour. I reached my car, which was tucked behind a rusted shipping container. I didn't get in. Instead, I opened the trunk and pulled out a heavy-duty flashlight and a spare set of plates I'd confiscated from a junker months ago. I swapped the plates in the rain, my fingers numb but precise. It wouldn't hold up to a professional scan, but it would buy me 5 minutes of confusion if I passed a patrol car. I drove toward the old rail yards, a place where the city's pulse was a low, industrial thrum. I knew Marcus was tracking my phone, so I did the only logical thing. I left it. I placed the device inside a plastic bag and duct-taped it to the underside of a city bus idling at a nearby terminal. As the bus pulled away, heading toward the north end of the city, my digital ghost went with it. Marcus and his new friends would spend the next hour chasing a public transit route while I moved into position. My target was Marcus's private residence, a small, tidy bungalow on the edge of the suburbs. It was the only thing he actually owned, and he was proud of it. To Marcus, that house represented his escape from the grime of the job. To me, it was leverage. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, my footsteps swallowed by the hiss of the rain. I didn't break in. I didn't have to. I knew where he kept the spare key, inside a fake plastic rock near the garden hose, a cliché that I'd mocked him for a dozen times over beer. I stepped into the house, the air warm and smelling of lemon polish and leather. It was too clean, the home of a man who tried to scrub the day's compromises off his skin before he went to sleep. I sat at his kitchen table and waited. I didn't touch anything. I didn't want to leave a trace of an intruder. I wanted to leave a trace of a presence. I placed a single item on the table, a photograph from our graduation at the academy. We were both grinning, our arms draped over each other's shoulders, full of the kind of idealism that life eventually grinds into dust. Beside it, I laid out a printout of the property records I'd found, the ones showing Sullivan's environmental violations and the financial mess that was currently swallowing the loft project. 40 minutes later, the front door opened. Marcus walked in, dripping wet, his face etched with a fatigue that went deeper than his bones. He didn't notice me at first. He threw his keys on the counter and sighed, a sound of absolute exhaustion. Then he turned and saw me sitting in the shadows of the breakfast nook. He didn't reach for his sidearm, he just froze, his breath hitching in the quiet room. "Beckett," he whispered, "you shouldn't be here." "I could say the same about you, Marcus. You shouldn't be in Sullivan Vance's pocket. It's a tight fit, and it's getting crowded in there." I gestured to the table. "Take a look." Marcus walked over, his movements stiff. He looked at the photo, then at the documents. He didn't say anything for a long time. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall and the rain drumming against the window pane. "He's going to win, Beck," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "He has the judges. He has the commissioner. You're fighting a landslide with a shovel." "A landslide only happens when the foundation fails," I replied, leaning forward into the light. "Sullivan is broke, Marcus. He's leveraged everything on that loft project, and the city is about to shut it down for the violations I found. He's not paying you with his money. He's paying you with the promise of future favors that he won't be in a position to grant. When he goes down, he's going to take every person who helped him hide his tracks." Marcus looked at the photo of us. "I have a mortgage, Beck. I have a pension to think about." "You won't have either if you're named as a co-conspirator in a witness tampering investigation. I already sent the recordings to a secure server. If anything happens to me, if I so much as get a parking ticket that looks suspicious, those files go to the state attorney. You're a smart guy. Do the math." I could see the gears turning. Marcus wasn't a bad man. He was a tired man who had mistaken proximity to power for security. He looked at the documents again, his eyes scanning the environmental citations. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want the location of the meeting tonight. Sullivan and Harlow are meeting with the evaluator's assistant. They're trying to hand over a gift to ensure the report goes their way. I know it's happening, I just don't know where." Marcus hesitated. He was standing on the edge of the cliff I'd imagined earlier. One way led back to a comfortable, compromised life. The other led into the storm with me. "The Blue Heron," Marcus said finally, his voice barely audible. "A private dining club on the waterfront. 8 o'clock. Sullivan has a regular table in the back, shielded from the main room." "Thank you, Marcus." I stood up. I didn't offer my hand. The time for handshakes had passed. "Do yourself a favor. Go to the precinct. Log a report about your concerns regarding the Vance investigation. Get it on the record now so when the house of cards falls, you can claim you were working from the inside." I walked toward the door. As I reached the handle, Marcus spoke again. "He's got people you don't know about, Beck. People who don't care about the law or the department. Be careful." "I'm always careful, Marcus. That's why I'm still here." I stepped back out into the rain, feeling a surge of momentum. I had the location. I had a window of time. Now I needed to prepare the final piece of the trap. I drove to Tina's place. She was waiting for me with a thermos of coffee and a laptop. Juniper was asleep on the sofa, tucked under a fleece blanket. Seeing her there, safe and quiet, reminded me why I was doing this. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about ensuring that her world remained honest. "I've got the files ready," Tina said, her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. "I've mapped out the financial trail. Sullivan's been moving money through a shell company to pay for the consultants he's using to lean on the school board and the evaluator's office. It's a mess, Beckett. A beautiful, incriminating mess." "Can you bridge it to the Blue Heron?" I asked. "I can do better. I've gained access to the digital guest logs for the club. Sullivan's reservation isn't under his name. It's under the name of the construction firm handling the lofts. He's trying to write the dinner off as a business expense." I smiled. It was almost too easy. Sullivan's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. He believed his stature made him invisible to the scrutiny he applied to everyone else. I spent the next 2 hours with Tina, orchestrating a sequence of events that would culminate at the waterfront. We weren't just going to interrupt a dinner, we were going to stage a public unveiling. I needed witnesses. I needed the kind of exposure that Sullivan couldn't suppress with a phone call or a bribe. At 7:30 p.m., I arrived at the Blue Heron. It was a sleek glass and steel building overlooking the harbor, where the black water of the bay slapped against the pilings. It was the kind of place where the wine cost more than my monthly rent, and the conversations were conducted in low, conspiratorial tones. I didn't try to go through the front door. I used the service entrance, wearing a dark waterproof jacket I'd lifted from a construction site earlier. I looked like just another worker coming in to check the plumbing or the electrics. I moved through the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of searing meat and expensive herbs, and found the service corridor that led to the private dining alcoves. I found Sullivan's table. He was sitting with Harlow and a man I recognized as the lead clerk from the evaluator's office, a man named Henderson who had a reputation for being flexible with his recommendations. I stayed in the shadows, my heart rate steady. I pulled out a small, high-resolution camera Tina had provided. I watched as Sullivan slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the white linen tablecloth. He was smiling, his face flushed with the triumph of a man who believed he had just bought his way out of a problem. Harlow was leaning forward, her face bright with a predatory excitement. She was already celebrating. She thought she had won. She thought the zero in my bank account was the end of the story. I waited until Henderson reached for the envelope. That was the moment, the point of no return. I didn't rush out. I didn't make a scene. I simply triggered the remote link Tina had set up. Throughout the Blue Heron, the sophisticated sound system, which usually played soft jazz, suddenly switched. A voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. It was Sullivan's voice from the recording I'd made at the construction site, boasting about his influence and his plans to manipulate the custody hearing. The restaurant fell silent. Every diner, every waiter, every influential figure in the room stopped and looked toward the source of the sound. I stepped out from the corridor, the camera still rolling. Sullivan froze, the envelope halfway between his hand and Henderson's. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. Harlow let out a sharp, strangled gasp. "Good evening, Sullivan," I said, my voice carrying through the silent room. "I hope the meal is worth the price, because I think you've just run out of credit." The look of pure, unadulterated shock on Sullivan's face was the first truly satisfying thing I'd seen in weeks. He looked down at the envelope, then at the crowded room, and finally at me. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just lost the dinner. He had lost the room. He had lost the city. And most importantly, he had lost his daughter's future as a bargaining chip. The tension in the air was physical, a taut wire ready to snap. I could see the security guards moving toward me from the front entrance, but I didn't care. The recording was playing on a loop now, and the guests were already pulling out their own phones, capturing the fall of the Honorable Sullivan Vance in high definition. "This is a mistake," Sullivan stammered, his voice weak. "No," I said, stepping closer. "A mistake is something you fix. This is a consequence, and it's just the beginning. The silence in the Blue Heron was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the tinny, looped echo of Sullivan's own voice coming through the ceiling speakers. It was a digital ghost repeating his arrogant boasts to a room full of people who had, until 5 minutes ago, viewed him as a pillar of the community. I stood at the edge of his table, the dampness of the rain still clinging to my jacket, watching the color drain from his face until he looked like a statue carved from cheap chalk. Harlow sat frozen, her hand still hovering near the wine glass, her eyes darting toward the exits as if she could vanish if she just wished for it hard enough. "Turn that off," Sullivan finally croaked, his voice lacking its usual judicial thunder. "Hayes, I will ruin you for this. This is illegal. This is a violation of privacy. This is harassment." "Actually, Sullivan, it's a public service," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to ensure the surrounding tables didn't miss a syllable. I glanced at Henderson, the clerk, who was currently trying to slide his chair back so fast he nearly tipped over. "And as for the envelope on the table, I think the authorities will be much more interested in the contents than the acoustics of the room." The security guards were closing in now, 2 large men in tailored blazers who looked like they spent more time at the gym than at the firing range. They were hesitant, though. They saw the camera in my hand and the badge clipped to my belt. Even in a place like this, people are wary of interfering with a man who looks like he has nothing left to lose. "I'm leaving," Henderson stammered, scrambling to his feet. He didn't even look at the envelope. He just wanted to be away from the radioactive remains of Sullivan's reputation. "Don't run on my account, Henderson," I said, stepped aside to let him pass, "but I'd keep your phone on. The state attorney is going to have a lot of questions about your dinner companions." Sullivan finally found his feet, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the white linen. "You think this changes anything? You think a recording and a scene in a restaurant gives you custody? I have resources you can't even imagine. By tomorrow morning, this will be buried, and you will be in a cell." "You're missing the point, Sullivan," I said, leaning in close. "I'm not trying to win a legal argument anymore. I'm showing everyone who you really are. And once the light is on, the cockroaches don't get to run the kitchen." I turned and walked out before the security guards could gather enough courage to touch me. I didn't need to stay for the finale. The room was doing the work for me. As I stepped back out into the cool harbor air, I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car pulling into the valet circle. Someone had called it in, likely Marcus, finally choosing a side that offered a future. I didn't stick around to chat with the responding officers. I had a more pressing matter. Harlow was the weak link, and now that the public exposure had shattered Sullivan's invincibility, she would be in a state of absolute chaos. I drove toward the Vance estate, knowing she would head there to gather whatever she could before the legal walls closed in. The drive was a blur of neon and wet pavement. My inner commentary was a relentless hum of strategy. She's going for the safe in the study. She knows Sullivan's secrets better than he does, and she's not going to stay on a sinking ship. She's a survivor, Beckett. Use that. I arrived at the house and saw her silver sedan already idling in the driveway, the trunk popped open. Harlow was frantic, carrying armfuls of clothes and leather-bound folders from the house. She looked like a different person than the poised woman from the restaurant. Her hair was a mess, and her movements were jerky and panicked. I parked my car, blocking her path once again. I stepped out and walked toward her. "Going somewhere, Harlow?" She screamed, dropping a stack of papers into the mud. "Get away from me. You've ruined everything. My father will have your head for this." "Your father is currently being questioned by the precinct commander in the lobby of a steakhouse," I said, my voice calm. "He's not coming to save you. And honestly, knowing Sullivan, he's probably already figuring out how to blame the whole thing on you. The recording, the envelope. He'll say you organized it all. He'll say he was just trying to protect his daughter from your instability." Harlow stopped. She looked at the house, then at me. The logic of my words hit her like a physical blow. She knew I was right. Sullivan Vance didn't have allies. He had assets. And when an asset became a liability, he cut it loose without a second thought. "What do you want, Beckett?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The truth. On camera. Right now." I pulled out my phone. "Tell me about the coaching. Tell me about the money Sullivan used to influence the evaluator. Tell me everything, and I'll make sure the prosecutor knows you cooperated. If you don't, you go down with him. And you know Sullivan will make sure you're the one who ends up with the heavy lifting." She looked at the papers in the mud, the records of their manipulation. She looked at the empty, dark windows of the mansion that had never truly been a home. She took a deep breath. "He made me do it," she started, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "He told me if I didn't get total custody, he would cut me off. He said you were a threat to his reputation. He was the one who hired Marcus to trail you. He was the one who set up the mock trials with the neighborhood kids." I kept the camera rolling as she spilled a decade's worth of secrets in 5 minutes. It was a torrent of betrayal, a detailed map of how Sullivan had used his power to twist the lives of everyone around him. By the time she was finished, she was sobbing, leaning against the cold metal of her car. "I'm taking the evidence from the house, Harlow," I said, reaching into her trunk and grabbing the folders she'd tried to save. "Go. Get a lawyer, a good one who doesn't know your father." I watched her drive away, her tires spinning on the wet gravel. I stood in the driveway of the Vance estate, holding the physical proof of their corruption. It was a heavy weight, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a tool. I went back into the house. The front door was still broken, the wood splintered where I had kicked it in earlier. I walked through the silent rooms, my footsteps echoing on the marble floors. I went to the study and found the safe Harlow had been aiming for. It was open. I reached inside and found what I was looking for: a ledger of Sullivan's consultation fees. It was a list of every bribe, every favor, and every piece of leverage he had used to maintain his position. I sat in his expensive leather chair and opened the ledger. It was a map of a kingdom built on sand. My inner commentary was quiet now, replaced by a cold, clinical satisfaction. "You were so busy looking down at everyone else, Sullivan. You forgot to check if the floor was still beneath you. I heard a noise from the hallway." I stood up, my hand going to the flashlight on my belt. "Beckett?" It was Marcus. He was standing in the doorway, looking battered and older than he had that afternoon. He wasn't wearing his badge. "I turned it in," he said, gesturing to his empty belt. I told them everything, about the surveillance, the payments, the errands. "They're at the precinct now, processing Sullivan." "Why are you here, Marcus?" "To make sure you didn't do anything stupid." He looked at the ledger in my hand. "Is that it?" "It's all here, every person he ever bought." Marcus sighed, a long, weary sound. "The department is going to be in chaos tomorrow. Half the senior staff is on that list in one way or another." "Then let it burn," I said. "We'll build something better on the ashes." I walked past him, leaving the house for the last time. I drove back to Tina's apartment, the morning light starting to gray the horizon. I found Juniper still asleep, her small face peaceful in the dim light. I sat on the edge of the sofa and watched her for a long time. The revenge was complete. Sullivan was finished, Harlow was gone, the money was gone, the house was a hollow shell, and the influence was a memory. But as I sat there, I realized that the hardest part was just beginning. I had to explain to my daughter why her world had changed. I had to help her navigate the ruins of her family. I had to be a father without the armor of my badge or the distraction of the chase. I looked at the ledger on the coffee table. I could use it to destroy 100 more people. I could become the new gatekeeper of the city's secrets. I could take the power Sullivan had lost and make it my own. I picked up the ledger and walked to the kitchen. I turned on the stove and watched the blue flame flicker. One by one, I tore out the pages and fed them to the fire. I didn't need their secrets. I didn't want their power. I just wanted my life back. The paper curled and blackened, the names of the powerful turning to ash in the heat. I felt a sense of lightness, a shedding of the darkness that had consumed me since the day I saw that school bag on the porch. I went back to the sofa and tucked the blanket around Juniper's shoulders. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw me and smiled, a sleepy, trusting look that made everything else irrelevant. "Daddy?" she whispered. "I'm here, Junie," I said, kissing her forehead. "I'm here." The city was waking up, the first sounds of traffic and life beginning to fill the air. The long shadow of Sullivan Vance was finally receding, leaving behind a clear, cold morning. I didn't have a plan for the next hour, let alone the next day. I didn't have a job, and my bank account was still empty. But as I held my daughter, I knew I had already won the only thing that mattered. The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that felt like a fresh start rather than a lingering wait. I stood on the sidewalk outside the municipal courthouse, watching the sunrise bleed across the glass facades of the city. I hadn't slept, but the exhaustion was a secondary concern to the finality of the day. In my pocket, I felt the weight of the flash drive containing the last of the digital records, the absolute insurance policy that would ensure Sullivan Vance never saw the inside of a courtroom as anything other than a defendant. My inner commentary was unusually quiet, lacking its typical sharp edge. "You did it, Beckett. You dismantled a dynasty with a set of pliers, a camera, and a refusal to blink. Now you just have to finish the job." The final hearing was a mere formality now, though Sullivan's remaining legal team was putting up a brave front. They were gathered on the courthouse steps, a cluster of dark suits and expensive briefcases, looking like a flock of crows waiting for a storm to pass. Sullivan was among them, though he looked diminished. His suit seemed too large for his frame, and the arrogance that had defined his posture for 40 years had been replaced by a cautious, hunted look. He saw me approaching, and for a moment the old fire flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the realization of the crowd gathered around us. I didn't stop to talk to him. I walked past the legal team and straight into the building, my footsteps echoing in the vast marbled rotunda. This was where Sullivan had spent his life wielding influence like a blade, but today the architecture felt indifferent to him. I reached the courtroom doors and found Tina waiting for me. She looked tired but triumphant, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. "The state attorney just received the files from the restaurant," she whispered, her voice buzzing with excitement. Henderson cracked. "He's naming names, Beckett. He's talking about the zoning boards, the school district, the whole works. Sullivan is being hit with felony-level misdeeds by the hour." "And Harlow?" I asked. "She signed the revised custody agreement. Supervised visits only, mandatory counseling, and she's agreed to a full disclosure of her father's financial interference in exchange for a lighter recommendation from the prosecutor. She's looking out for herself, as usual." I nodded. It was the only way it could have ended. Harlow was a creature of self-preservation, and without Sullivan's shadow to hide in, she had chosen the only path that kept her out of a jumpsuit. I felt a pang of something, not regret, but a weary recognition of the cost. Juniper would have her mother in her life, but it would be a relationship defined by boundaries and supervised rooms. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. The courtroom doors opened, and we filed inside. The atmosphere was electric, thick with the tension of a high-stakes collapse. I sat behind my attorney, a young, hungry woman who had seen the potential in this case when everyone else had looked away. Sullivan sat across the aisle, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. He didn't look back at me. He was staring at the judge, a woman who had once been his protege and who now looked at him with a mixture of pity and professional distance. The hearing was swift. The evidence of custodial interference was so overwhelming that the judge didn't even bother with a lengthy deliberation. She read the new terms into the record, her voice firm and echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Sullivan's pension was brought up, and the mention of felony-level misconduct hung in the air like a physical weight. Because the crimes involved the manipulation of the judicial system he had once served, the consequences were maximized. He wasn't just losing his reputation, he was losing his livelihood. As the judge slammed the gavel, I felt a strange lack of a peak. There was no sudden explosion, no dramatic outburst. It was just the sound of a system finally working the way it was supposed to. Sullivan stood up slowly, his lawyers whispering in his ear, but he looked through them. He looked at the empty jury box, at the seal of the court, and finally he looked at me. I stood up and walked toward the aisle. We met in the center of the room, two men who had spent a lifetime navigating the same halls but from opposite directions. "You think you've won something," Sullivan said, his voice a dry rasp. "But look around you, Beckett. You've destroyed a family. You've left your daughter with nothing but the ruins of what I built for her." "I didn't destroy anything, Sullivan," I replied, my voice calm and devoid of the sarcasm that usually fueled me. "I just stopped the rot from spreading. Juniper doesn't need your ruins. She needs a father who doesn't treat her like a strategic asset. You built a house of cards and blamed the wind for knocking it over. But the wind didn't do this. Your own choices did." I walked past him, leaving him standing in the middle of the room he used to rule. I headed for the exit, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind me with a final, echoing thud. I found Juniper waiting in the hallway with Tina. She was sitting on a wooden bench, swinging her legs and looking at a picture book. When she saw me, she dropped the book and ran toward me, her small arms wrapping around my waist with a force that nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. "Is it over, Daddy?" she asked, her face pressed against my jacket. "It's over, Junie. We're going home." We walked out of the courthouse and into the bright midday sun. The city was loud, full of the mundane sounds of traffic, sirens, and people moving toward their own lives. It felt real. It felt earned. I walked to my car, which was still wearing the mud of the industrial district. I didn't care about the zero in my bank account. I didn't care that my career as a detective was likely over, at least in this precinct. Those things were just details now, the wreckage of a storm that had finally blown itself out. I helped Juniper into the back seat and buckled her in. As I started the engine, I saw Marcus standing on the sidewalk across the street. He was leaning against a lamppost, his hands in his pockets. He didn't wave, and I didn't nod. We just looked at each other for a long moment, an acknowledgement of the bridge we had burned together. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, a man starting over in a city that didn't know his name anymore. I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look in the rearview mirror at the courthouse. I looked ahead, toward the highway that led out of the city center. "Can we go get ice cream?" Juniper asked from the back. "Whatever you want, Junie," I said, catching her eye in the mirror. My inner commentary made one last appearance, a soft, almost tired whisper. You're broke, you're unemployed, and you've got a mountain of paperwork waiting for you, but look at that smile. That's the only victory that was ever worth the fight. I drove through the city, watching the skyline retreat. The long shadows of the morning had vanished, replaced by the flat, honest light of high noon. Every street we passed felt different, as if the air had been scrubbed clean. The fear that had lived in the pit of my stomach for months was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet determination. We stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the booths were covered in cracked red vinyl. I sat across from my daughter and watched her devour a giant sundae, her face lit with a simple, uncomplicated joy. I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I didn't have to check the parking lot for black sedans. The revenge was harsh, physically and socially impactful, and it had left my enemies in the dirt. Sullivan would spend the rest of his life in legal battles he couldn't win, and Harlow would have to learn how to exist without the safety net of her father's corruption. But as I sat there, listening to Juniper tell me about a dream she'd had about a flying rabbit, I realized that the true revenge wasn't their downfall. The true revenge was our survival. It was the fact that we were sitting here, in a nondescript diner, free of their influence and their lies. I finished my coffee and stood up, reaching into my pocket for the last few dollars I had. I left them on the table and held the door open for Juniper. The air outside was warm now, the scent of rain replaced by the smell of sun on asphalt. "Ready to go?" I asked. "Ready," she said, taking my hand. I didn't have an epilogue. I didn't need one. The story didn't end with a sunset or a grand speech. It ended with a car moving down a long, open road, the driver's eyes focused on the path ahead, and a little girl in the back seat singing a song only she knew the words to. The city skyline was a jagged memory in the distance, and the future was a wide, blank canvas. I accelerated onto the highway, the engine roaring with a newfound strength. I watched the miles tick away, each one taking us further from the shadow of the Vance estate. The past was a closed file, locked away in the archives of a life I was leaving behind. I looked at the horizon, where the road met the sky. There were no more traps to set, no more secrets to uncover. Just the road, the car, and the girl who made it all worth it. I pressed my foot down on the gas, feeling the car surge forward, and for the first time in a very long time, I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding.